Oh, nice shooting, Tex.
Today, at the Central Hall, Westminster, Labour began a 4-day party conference. It's only 2 months since the general election, but you may have noticed that already what Labour ministers are saying sounds very different from what they were saying before and during that election. So, as the Labour Party get down to their conference, here are just some of the things they were saying not so long ago. Words they may like to forget. Their words. Let's start with prices and inflation. During the election, Mr. Wilson seemed in no doubt things were getting better. In a speech in Lancashire, he said,
"Price rises in the shops are slowing down.
whichever way you looked at the figures, he said, they all
Point in the same direction to a significant reduction in the speed of price increases."
The Prices Minister, Mrs. Williams, was saying the same thing.
All one can say about inflation is that it is beginning to move downwards.
So, according to Labour, inflation was getting better. But how much better? At the beginning of the election campaign, the Labour manifesto said,
From Japan to France, from the United States to Britain, prices are rising at between 15% and 25% a year.
that was on 16th September 1974. Then, just a week later, Mr. Healy told us that inflation was only half that. At Labour's morning press conference, he declared,
Inflation is currently running at 8.4%.
and he produced a graph to prove it. Could the rate of inflation, which the previous week was somewhere between 15 and 25%, suddenly be cut to only 8.4%? No. It was a carefully concocted figure. The Times went into a detailed explanation of how the figure had been worked out and said,
It is disagreeable that one should have to research a Chancellor of the Exchequer statistics in order to find how he has managed to arrive at a clearly misleading figure. It is shocking that a man who is pretending, on the basis of such misleading statistics, to a great victory over inflation, which he has not in fact achieved, should accuse his political opponents of untruth.
and the Daily Express comment was,
It is really too much to have as Chancellor a man who cannot see inflation when it is staring him in the face.
The London Evening Standard asked some economists what they thought.
The Chancellor's figures are monstrously dishonest.
Said Professor Alan Day, Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Professor John Vasey at Brunel University agreed.
The Chancellor's figures are totally inaccurate.
Meanwhile, what was the Prices Minister, Mrs. Shirley Williams, saying? During the election, she was asked about future price rises. At a press conference, she replied,
There is no evidence at all of price increases stored up in the pipeline.
it took only a month for her statement to be exploded by what the Sun called
The Healy time bomb. Sky-high petrol, coal, gas, electricity rises soon.
The same paper went on,
Chancellor Dennis Healy lit the fuse for a new cost-of-living explosion in his budget yesterday.
the Daily Express had the same story.
His budget measures will lead to higher prices.
So did the Daily Mirror
Everyone will be hit by higher prices.
and the Daily Mail.
You name it, and it's going up. Petrol at 62.5 pence. Then electricity, rates, gas, fares, and post.
Now, how does all this square with what Mrs. Williams said at the election about there being no evidence at all of price increases stored up in the pipeline? All right, we all know that some prices had to go up anyway. But then we were told that Labour had its social contract. According to Labour's manifesto, the social contract lay,
At the heart of this manifesto and of our programme to save the nation.
Mr. Wilson called it.
The boldest experiment in civilized government that Britain has ever seen.
So, first of all, what is it? If it's designed to save the nation, one of its main jobs must surely be to keep pay increases in line with what the nation can afford. Well, that's what we were led to believe. And the TUC guidelines on wage increases, published on 26 June, actually stated that
It is important that the 12-month interval between major increases should in general continue to apply.
that sounds all very fine. But how does it work in practice? At the TUC conference in September, Mr. Len Murray said,
The social contract is not merely or even mainly concerned with wages.
and this is where the confusion began. Mr. Arthur Scargill, leader of the Yorkshire Miners.
The National Union of Mine Workers has only one social contract, a loyalty to the membership.
Mr. Arthur Flicker, a Ford shop steward, put it this way.
The social contract means nothing to us. If it means that our lads have to work for less than they are entitled to, then to hell with it.
Little wonder that the president of Nalgo, Mr. Gardner, hit out at the...
Strange concept of the social contract. No one seemed to know what it meant, he said.
And the Ford pay offer is a good example. Was the offer inside or outside the contract? Mr. Jack Jones thought it was inside.
The social contract is flexible. There has been no breach.
But Mr. Healy didn't think so. Asked if the offer conflicted with the social contract, he replied,
It seems to me that it does.
Mr. Foote disagreed with Mr. Healy.
I understand the proposals put forward by the unions at Ford's are well within the social compact.
But then, a few days later, Mr. Foote began to have doubts.
I don't disguise from you that we in the Department of Employment, the government, are concerned about one aspect of it.
Mr. Ben didn't seem to care. He simply declared that...
The social contract is not to keep wages down.
Isn't it? After all, the Financial Times reported that the government had...
Recently spoken out against settlements in banking, insurance, the Scottish road haulage industry and the Ford Motor Company for being in breach of the TUC's wage bargaining guidelines.
And the miners? How has this social contract helped there? Well, you will remember that only last week they first of all rejected the productivity scheme, and then they said that they want an extra £30 a week. This was how the papers saw it. The Daily Express,
Miners bury the contract.
the Daily Mail.
Miners sink the contract.
Now, let's just recap. During the election, Labour told us inflation was getting better. It's getting worse. They told us that inflation was 8.4%. It's about twice that. They told us there was no evidence of further price increases in the pipeline. Then came all the price rises in Mr. Healy's budget. They told us that the social contract lay at the heart of their programme to save the nation, when they knew they couldn't enforce it and had nothing to put in its place. As Mr. Heath said during the election,
We are waging a struggle up and down the country against a determined and consistent attempt to keep the truth from the British people. Everything that Labour leaders have said has been aimed at covering up the crisis which faces us.
it was the Conservatives who set out the facts. Soaring prices, rising unemployment, and a yawning balance of payments deficit. But inflation was the central issue, and the Conservative manifesto warned.
No major democracy has ever survived such a catastrophic rise in the cost of living. We cannot be sure that we would be the exception.
It continued,
The only way the battle can be won is by the government and the people of this country uniting on a national policy. No government should pursue a policy of wholesale nationalization for party ends, nor seek to further the interests of only a section or a class of the population.
the manifesto frankly admitted that there could be no early improvement in general living standards. But it singled out three clear priorities.
We will act now in three areas which have been particularly hard hit by inflation and which, in one way or another, affect the basic livelihood of every family in the country: pensions, housing, and food production.
And what did the newspapers say? The Times?
The Conservatives have rightly identified the central issue and put forward a programme for dealing with it that ought, in a more rational world, to be common ground between the three parties.
The Guardian?
The Tory manifesto is well conceived and well directed.
The Daily Express?
The Tory manifesto matches the country's needs and the public's mood.
And the Daily Mail?
The policies it puts before the British people are sombre and suited to the inflationary crisis that is threatening to crush the juice of moderation and democracy out of our system.
On 12th October, the Times described Mr. Heath in these words.
A serious and courageous man.
They said he had told the British people more important truths than they wanted to listen to. A pity Labour didn't have the courage to do the same. Good night.